Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you all today. Thank you for attending today's seminar. As mentioned, my name is Christina Vasiliou, and I'm the lead analyst for the immunology and inflammation content at Datamonitor Healthcare. And today, I'll be sharing data from Datamonitor Healthcare's patient-based forecasts for rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and Crohn's disease to highlight how we expect the immunology space across the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets to evolve over the next decade. So I would like to start by surveying the current market. In 2016, all 3 indications were dominated by originator anti-TNF products. It's fair to say that anti-TNFs are now the standard of care when it comes to the treatment of moderate to severe patients who are inadequately controlled by generic conventional therapy. What's interesting is that less than 10% of revenue came from non-biologic therapies in these indications in 2016, and this is well out of skew with the overall pharma industry. This highlights that until recently, all novel agents that were approved for use in these indications were biologic agents. And therefore, this means that there has been a historical unmet need for novel oral small molecule therapies. And this is a need that is only being addressed now with the relatively recent approvals of drug classes such as JAK inhibitors and phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitors. And we can see that these drug classes have already captured single-digit revenue share in 2016. Furthermore, we expect additional novel small molecule and biologic therapies to launch across these indications over our forecast period. Another interesting point is that it's in the immunology space that we expect to see the biggest impact from biosimilars. And as a reminder, biosimilars are non-originator versions of originator biologics that have been approved by an abbreviated pathway and are therefore expected to launch at a substantially lower price compared to the originator biologics. And anti-TNF biosimilars have already entered all 3 markets that I'm covering today. And they really represent a different type of innovation because they have the potential to lower the cost of the established standard of care, though this will be at the expense of blunting uptake of novel therapies, which are higher cost. So with this high-level overview of the current market established, I will now move on to clarify how Datamonitor Healthcare builds patient-based forecasts. So a simplified methodology is shown here. The starting point of our forecasts is the total prevalent cases of each disease in each of the markets we cover. We then leverage our primary market research with physicians and payers to apply a series of filters, including diagnosis rates, the number of patients treated by a specialist, the number of patients receiving DMARD therapy. And using our survey data, we are also able to see what the preferred therapies are at each line of therapy and each patient subpopulation. For example, moderate to severe patients. And this provides us with a baseline of how the different brands are performing, and we benchmark this against company-reported sales. We then apply market events, such as new product launches and biosimilar erosion, to forecast our expectations for the performance of each brand in terms of patient share. We then convert patient share into volume using dosing and compliance assumptions. And finally, we convert volume into dollar sales based on our expectations for pricing. And I should note that the forecasts included in this presentation cover the 2016 to 2025 period. So I would like to begin by sharing our expectations for the RA space. So RA is the biggest immune indication in terms of revenue, with total 2016 sales of $18.2 billion. Here is a snapshot of the 2016 RA market share at the therapeutic class level. we can see that there are 5 novel therapeutic classes approved for use in RA, with anti-TNFs capturing 68% of the market, even though there are 3 other novel biologic classes of agents approved and 1 novel oral small molecule class, which is the JAK inhibitors. Going from this therapeutic class level to the brand level, it's immediately clear that the dominance of the anti-TNFs is based on the performance of 2 products, Humira and Enbrel, which together capture more than 50% of the market. So Enbrel was the first anti-TNF to be approved for use in RA prior to 2000, and it was swiftly followed by Humira and Remicade. As a reminder, Remicade is an intravenous therapy, whereas Humira and Enbrel are both administered subcutaneously. However, we expect that anti-TNFs will face challenges in the future. And this is a top-level view of our country forecasts for rheumatoid arthritis across the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets. As you can see, the RA market is forecast to peak in 2023 with sales of $24.2 billion before declining to $23.7 billion in 2025. And there are 3 key market events driving our forecast. 2 of these events are key drivers of market growth. Firstly, the increasing prevalence of RA, and secondly, the growth of newly launched products and the launch of pipeline products. And the third event is a key barrier to market growth, and this is the entry of biosimilars of key biologic brands that will lose patent protection and market exclusivity over the forecast period. And this will lead to a material price erosion in the market as the originator brands decrease in price to stay competitive with biosimilars and also to prevent patient share loss. So now let's take a deeper dive into each of these market events, starting with increasing prevalence. So we've seen that prevalence is a key driver of market growth. Here you can see that the prevalent cases of RA are set to increase in the US and 5 major EU markets, and this is primarily driven by the underlying demographics of an aging population. So the second growth driver I mentioned earlier was the growth of newly launched products and the launch of pipeline products. In RA, this can really be summed up into 2 key classes, the JAK inhibitors and the interleukin-6 inhibitors. I'll start by focusing on JAK inhibitors as they will have a more relevant role to play in the evolution of the RA landscape. We expect JAK inhibitors to do moderately well, forecasting that they captured sales of $0.8 billion in 2016, and we expect the sales to grow substantially to just under $4 billion in 2025, when they will represent 16% of all RA sales. And there are 4 JAK inhibitors included in our RA forecast. Firstly, we have Pfizer's Xeljanz, which is now marketed in the US, Japan, and Europe. We have Eli Lilly's Olumiant, which launched in Europe and Japan in 2017, and we expect it to launch in the US in 2018. So what's interesting is that the FDA initially issued a complete response letter for Olumiant, noting that an additional clinical study was required to further assess its risk-to-benefit profile across the different doses. And this was in light of the imbalance in thromboembolic events that was observed in the placebo-controlled period of the RA program. This was unexpected and at the time surprising news, especially following Olumiant's approval in Europe. However, a couple of months after the complete response letter, the FDA reversed its request for an additional study. And Eli Lilly and Incyte announced that they will be refiling the drug for approval before the end of January 2018 in the US. We have 2 further JAK inhibitors included in our forecast. Filgotinib, a joint effort by Galapagos and Gilead, and 1 JAK inhibitor from AbbVie, and that's upadacitinib. So why is it that we think that JAK inhibitors will have a material impact? This is mainly because we think they're well placed to penetrate the early lines of therapy. These are orally administered products, and as I mentioned earlier, the RA market is dominated by anti-TNF therapies that are either administered subcutaneously or intravenously. And perhaps more importantly, JAK inhibitors have demonstrated convincing efficacy data to date and an overall favorable safety profile, which is overall in line with that we've seen for anti-TNFs. Their uptake will also be driven by the fact that professional bodies like EULAR have placed JAK inhibitors at parity with biologics. And this is in treatment guidelines that are hugely influential and will drive the uptake of these oral small molecules. One question mark does remain, and this is the potential negative impact that anti-TNF biosimilars in Europe and Japan particularly will have on JAK inhibitors, with biosimilars potentially blocking JAK inhibitors from entering early lines of therapy. And this is something we have considered in our forecast. So this is a snapshot of how the JAK inhibitor class as a whole will perform over the forecast period. But now let's take a look at the individual JAK inhibitors that we are forecasting. Even though Olumiant will be the second to market in Japan and the US, we forecast it to be the most commercially successful JAK inhibitor, with 2025 sales of approximately $1.5 billion. And the reason behind this is that Olumiant had a very strong development program. So Eli Lilly designed a very comprehensive program for Olumiant, making sure that the drug would have evidence for use in multiple patient subpopulations, including conventional DMARD naive patients, biologic naive patients, and also inadequate responders to TNF inhibition. Equally important is the fact that they have had head-to-head trials versus Humira and methotrexate, where they were able to demonstrate superiority. A key opinion leader we spoke to has summed it up quite well, and to paraphrase, Olumiant looks compelling. It has done very well in multiple patient subpopulations, and it's about as good as data as you can hope for at launch. Now moving to the interleukin-6 inhibitor class. As I mentioned earlier, this is perhaps less exciting than JAK inhibitors. We believe that the sales and the market share of this class will be marginally impacted by the launch of a new interleukin-6 inhibitor, namely Kevzara. So Roche's Actemra has been on the market for several years, and it was this year joined by Sanofi's and Regeneron's Kevzara in the US and EU, and we expect Kevzara to also launch in Japan in Q1 of next year. Previously, we had anticipated that Johnson & Johnson's Sirukumab would also launch in the RA market, since it completed phase 3 trials in RA and it was filed for approval with the regulators. However, our concerns were first raised when GSK, which had partnered with Johnson & Johnson for this asset, chose to return rights to the product earlier this year. And this was followed by a complete response letter from the FDA requesting additional data for Sirukumab in order to assess further its safety profile. Johnson & Johnson subsequently announced that it will no longer pursue global approval for Sirukumab in rheumatoid arthritis. However, Kevzara is unlikely to benefit from Sirukumab's dropout, and we think that Kevzara will mainly be relegated to late lines of therapy. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we think that JAK inhibitors are much better placed to penetrate early lines of therapy. So this means that naturally interleukin-6 inhibitors get pushed back as a therapy choice. And we also have the arrival of biosimilar tocilizumab, which will put pressure both on Actemra but also on Kevzara. The most important point is that Kevzara has not demonstrated any efficacy or safety advantages over Actemra, and this is something that will negatively impact its uptake. And then looking at this figure here, we can see that Kevzara will not really challenge Actemra's dominant position in the class. And Actemra will only be marginally impacted by the launch of Kevzara. However, the launch of biosimilar tocilizumab will cause a revenue decline for Actemra. A key opinion leader we spoke to has summed up the mood around Kevzara quite well, noting that while it has done quite well in trials, it has not demonstrated any advantage over Actemra. And one could argue that Sanofi and Regeneron should have included a head-to-head study versus Actemra in Kevzara's development program. And it would be interesting to see if there will be a phase 4 study versus Actemra in the future. And if there will be one, and depending on the results, it would impact this forecast. Now I would like to focus on the originator anti-TNF brands and their potential biosimilars, something that I've been mentioning throughout the presentation so far. So we expect sales of the originator anti-TNFs to peak at just under $15 billion in 2023, before declining to $12.8 billion. And this is primarily due to price erosion that I've also mentioned earlier, but also because we expect biosimilars to take patient share from the originator brands. Regarding the anti-TNF biosimilars, the situation is pretty clear in Europe, where infliximab and etanercept biosimilars are already available, and we expect biosimilar adalimumab to also launch by late 2018. Similarly, in Japan, biosimilar infliximab is already available, and we have some clear assumptions around the launch of etanercept and adalimumab biosimilars. However, the situation in the US is slightly more clouded. Infliximab biosimilar launched in the US in late 2016, and we don't currently forecast the launch for biosimilar etanercept in the US, and that's based on Enbrel's so-called submarine patents, potentially safeguarding it from biosimilar competition until 2028 or 2029. However, these patents have been challenged in the past, and we do expect further challenges down the road. For biosimilar adalimumab, we expect that to launch in the US in Q1 2023. And this is based on recent news from MPhil on the global resolution of all the intellectual property-related litigation for Amgen, which will delay the launch of Amgevita, which is Amgen's biosimilar adalimumab in the US until January 2023. While this does not prevent other biosimilar developers from undertaking an at-risk launch or successfully challenging patents held by AbbVie for Humira, we think that it is unlikely for a biosimilar adalimumab to launch in the US before 2023. So now let's take a look at how we expect the individual anti-TNF brands and their biosimilar versions to perform over the forecast period. The sales of the key subcutaneous anti-TNF brands, Enbrel and Humira, are facing headwinds as biosimilars launch in Europe and Japan. However, the overall sales of the two brands will continue to grow until 2023, when they will start declining following the launch of biosimilar adalimumab in the US. To note, we forecast biosimilars to launch at a 20 to 35% discount to the originator brands, and this is in line with what we have been seeing to date. And we expect originator anti-TNFs to lose to lose revenue by two factors when it comes to biosimilars. First of all is patient share loss to biosimilars. Overall, we expect biosimilars to capture up to 55% of patient share over the forecast period. And these are patients who would have otherwise been treated by the originator brands had the biosimilars not been available. And the second factor is price erosion, as the originator brands attempt to stave off deeper patient share loss, and we expect a price erosion of up to 30% for the originator brands over the forecast period. And we also expect biosimilars to decline in price over the forecast period. In essence, we expect that there will be a 20 to 35% gap maintained between the originator biologics and biosimilars. So even though Enbrel will not face a direct biosimilar etanercept competitor in the US, we expect marginal cross-brand erosion from biosimilar adalimumab on Enbrel, and we expect Enbrel to decline in price to keep up with the declining net price of Humira over the forecast period. So now let's take a look at what all this means. I initially showed what the RA market looked like in 2016, and now you can see this together with what we forecast the RA market to look like in 2025. We can see that the anti-TNFs are still performing strongly, with Humira and Enbrel remaining the market leaders. It's clear that the market in 2025 is a lot more fragmented than the market in 2016, and this is because of the launch of additional therapies. And novel brands are forecast to capture 13% of RA sales in 2025, with Olumiant performing most strongly due to the rationale I provided earlier. Now turning to psoriasis. Here we can see that there are 4 novel drug classes available to physicians in psoriasis, 3 of which are biologic classes. So we've got anti-TNFs and 2 interleukin classes. And we have 1 novel oral small molecule class, which is the phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor class. Again, the anti-TNFs dominate the market. However, they don't dominate as strongly as in RA, and this is because the other classes have performed quite strongly and they have been able to penetrate early lines of therapy. Again, going from the therapeutic class view to the brand view, we can see that, like in RA, Humira is the market leader in psoriasis, and Stelara follows, again highlighting that non-TNF biologics have been able to penetrate early lines of therapy in psoriasis. Interestingly, Otezla and Cosentyx, which only launched in 2014 and 2015 respectively, have been able to very rapidly capture market share, with each of these products having just under 10% of market share in 2016. So this is our top-level country forecast for psoriasis. Like RA, the psoriasis market across the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets is forecast to peak in 2023 with sales of $11.4 billion before declining to $11.1 billion in 2025. And again, there are 3 events driving this forecast, which are similar to the events I've described for the RA forecast. So we have 2 growth drivers, the increasing prevalence in the US and the launch and growth of novel brands. And 1 is a key barrier to market growth, which is price erosion due to biosimilars. So now let's take a look at each of the drug classes I mentioned and how they will perform over the forecast period. So the sales of the marketed originator anti-TNFs are forecast to decline, primarily due to patient share and price erosion following biosimilars. And this is a similar dynamic to the one we saw for RA earlier. The key difference between the RA and psoriasis market is that in psoriasis, we have the added impact of Celgene's phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor, Otezla, which, as I mentioned earlier, it has performed quite strongly. It has been able to penetrate early lines of therapy, and we expect it to take further patient share from anti-TNFs at early lines. So layering Otezla onto this figure, we can see that it's expected to perform strongly over the forecast period. And the rationale for this is that it's very well differentiated from anti-TNF biologics. It has a more convenient mode of administration, being an oral therapy. It has a more favorable safety profile, something that cannot be said about the JAK inhibitors in RA. And importantly, it launched at a lower cost compared to that of the anti-TNFs. A US key opinion leader that we spoke to highlighted that there has been a high level of use of Otezla in the US, and this is because of its convenient oral formulation and its lower cost, as well as its favorable side effect profile, which requires no laboratory monitoring. And this again makes it a very easy product to use, especially in milder cases. And importantly, Otezla also represents an opportunity to delay biologic therapy, and this is something that physicians, payers, and patients are keen to do. Now, looking at the key marketed interleukin inhibitors in psoriasis, We have Stelara, an interleukin-12/23 inhibitor, and Taltz and Cosentyx, which are both interleukin-17A inhibitors. Grouping them together, we can see that there will be a material impact on Stelara's revenue over the forecast period due to the growth of Cosentyx and Taltz. And just to highlight the key dynamics at play here, Cosentyx demonstrated superior efficacy to Stelara, and it also demonstrated a comparable safety profile to Stelara. Taltz also outperformed Stelara in a head-to-head study. However, we expect Stelara to remain the leading interleukin inhibitor, and this is because of physician and patient familiarity with the drug, its real-world evidence, and also its more favorable dosing schedule. So we also expect a series of interleukin-23 inhibitors to launch over the forecast period, which will lead to an increasingly saturated market. To highlight, we are not expecting the interleukin-23 inhibitors to garner meaningful sales, and this is primarily due to their late arrival to the market. So here you can see the interleukin-23 inhibitors included in this forecast. We have Tremfya, which was approved in the US earlier this year, and we have two additional interleukin-23 inhibitors, risankizumab and tildrakizumab, which are forecast to launch from 2018. So now let's take a look at what the psoriasis market will look like in 2025. Again, similar to RA, we see a much more fragmented marketplace here, and this is due to the launch of additional agents. The sheer number of interleukin inhibitors and the growth of the interleukin inhibitor class as a whole will mean that they will account for 40% of the psoriasis market in 2025, with Stelara being the dominant interleukin inhibitor with 19% of the market. However, Humira is expected to remain the overall market leader. Now, turning to Crohn's disease, we can see that the 2016 market resembles the one we've seen for RA and psoriasis, with anti-TNFs dominating. However, Enbrel is not approved for use in inflammatory bowel disease, so the key dominant players here are Humira and Remicade. What's interesting is that unlike rheumatoid arthritis, where physicians have had options like Actemra or Ensia and Rituxan, and unlike psoriasis, where physicians had Stelara, in Crohn's disease, there has been, until recently, a real scarcity of novel agents available for patients who are inadequate responders to conventional therapy. Until 2014, the only branded therapy the only novel therapy apart from the anti-TNFs available for Crohn's disease was Tysabri, which is associated with a series of safety concerns and an increased risk of PML. The situation changed somewhat in 2014 with the arrival of Entyvio, which, as you can see, has performed quite well with approximately 9% of market share in 2016. And in late 2016, we also saw the arrival of Stelara. So unlike the RA and psoriasis markets, the Crohn's disease market is forecast to continue to grow throughout the forecast period, reaching sales of approximately $9 billion in 2025. And this overall growth represents a compound annual growth rate of 4.2%, which is higher than the 2.6% seen for RA and psoriasis. The key dynamics at play here are similar to the ones we've seen for RA and psoriasis. However, the key difference here is that the magnitude of the growth drivers is a lot stronger, and this is because we have novel agents launching into an indication that has been starved of innovation. And this is reflected by the fact that we expect these newly launched and pipeline agents to capture almost half of the Crohn's disease market by 2025, as physicians will rapidly adopt them. And we expect a series of agents to be available over our forecast period. So we have Entyvio and Stelara, which are now marketed in most major markets. And we have, this will be followed by etrolizumab, which is an anti-integrin, which is a similar mechanism of action as Entyvio. We've got filgotinib, a JAK inhibitor, and the stem cell therapy CX601. As you can see, Celgene's SMAD7 antisense oligonucleotide Mongersen has been crossed out from this table. So a few days ago, Celgene announced that it will terminate the 2 phase 3 trials for Mongersen in Crohn's disease based on an analysis on the risk to benefit profile for Mongersen. And this analysis was carried out by a data monitoring committee. And we believe that this decision was based on an overall lack of efficacy, given that the data monitoring committee has not identified any meaningful safety imbalances. So this discontinuation of the phase 3 program is probably due to an overall lack of efficacy. So now let's take a look at how these newly launched and emerging agents will perform over the forecast period. We can see that Stelara will overtake Entyvio, and they will become the leader among these newly launched and emerging agents. And this is mainly because of its favorable safety profile and its strong efficacy, but also because of physician experience with the drug due to its availability in psoriasis. Entyvio, while it has done quite well to date, it will be strongly hit by Stelara. And a key opinion leader we spoke to highlighted that Stelara has a faster onset of action than Entyvio, and it has a good safety profile. And the key opinion leader noted that he will indeed be prescribing Stelara over Entyvio, and that Stelara is expected to become the alternative to TNFs in Crohn's disease. Now, the stem cell therapy CX601 is an interesting example. Even though it has the potential to address a key unmet need in the treatment of perianal fistulizing Crohn's disease, this represents a niche patient population, meaning that its overall market potential will be limited. As you can see, Mongersen has been crossed out from this figure, and this is based on the recent news on the discontinuation of its phase 3 program. And we anticipate that some of the market share that we initially expected Mongersen to capture will now be captured by other late-phase therapies, or possibly Celgene's ozanimod, which is currently in phase 2 trials in Crohn's disease. Now let's take a look at how the Crohn's disease market will look like in 2025. Finally, we expect Humira to lose its leading position in at least one immune indication, with Stelara marginally being the leader in Crohn's disease in 2025. And similar to RA and psoriasis, we see a much more fragmented market space in 2025 due to the launch of all these novel therapies. Now, just to sum up everything I've discussed today, all 3 markets are expected to grow until 2023. And this is based on increasing prevalence and the adoption of newly launched and emerging therapies. And from 2023 onwards, the RA and psoriasis markets will decline as anti-TNF biosimilars increasingly capture patient share and cause progressive price erosion. The RA market in particular is at higher risk from biosimilars, and this is because it's expected to be dominated by anti-TNFs, to remain dominated by anti-TNFs throughout the forecast period. So if we were to look at the market beyond 2025, it's likely that the RA market would decline more rapidly than that for psoriasis and Crohn's disease. But even within our forecast period, it means that the RA market is more susceptible to further declines should the biosimilars environment be more competitive than current assumptions. Unlike RA and psoriasis, the Crohn's disease market will continue to grow until the terminal year of the forecast, and this is based on the high adoption of new and emerging therapies. And again, this is related to the fact that until recently there has been an overall scarcity of novel agents available in this indication. Each market will become increasingly fragmented with multiple entrants with the same mechanism of action. So we have the JAK inhibitors and interleukin-6 inhibitors in RA. We have interleukin-23 and interleukin-17 inhibitors in psoriasis. And we have the anti-integrin inhibitors in Crohn's disease. And this will likely empower payers to be increasingly demanding due to this intra-class competition. And this will only be exacerbated by the presence of biosimilars. Thank you very much for listening.